This is the business Blackbook, where billion-dollar empires are built and collapse. What if the most powerful nation on Earth decided it wanted to own a region it had no business being in? What if oil, religion, ideology, and empire all crashed into each other at the exact same point on the map? That is the story of the modern Middle East. And today, we are going to decode it completely, not as a war story, not as a political debate, but as a system of power, interests, and consequences that shaped the entire world we live in today. Let us begin. To understand the modern Middle East, you first need to understand what it actually is. The Middle East is not a natural geographic idea. It is a European one, a label placed on a region by outsiders who saw it as the middle of what they considered the East. Arbitrary, yes, but the name stuck, and the borders even more arbitrary. The region we call the Middle East today is literally where human civilization began. Modern-day Iraq, ancient rivers, ancient empires, ancient everything. But for thousands of years, empires rose and fell through this region. And with every empire came new lines on the map, new rulers, new rules. The most recent redrawing happened in the early 20th century, when European powers, specifically the British and the French, sat down and divided this region amongst themselves. They did not ask the people who lived there. They did not look at language or ethnicity or cultural identity. They just sliced it up and said, "These are our territories now." And then, eventually, they left. But the lines they drew, those stayed, and those lines became the skeleton of the modern Middle East. That is where our real story begins. Now, to understand why America entered this region, you have to understand one word: oil. It is the 1930s. The United States has spent an entire century moving westward across the North American continent. It has expanded into the Pacific. It is becoming a global power. But the world is also changing. The First World War had just been fought with a new kind of weapon. Machines, tanks, warships, aircraft, all powered by one substance: oil. Germany lost that war in part because it could not sustain the fuel demands of modern warfare. The Americans noticed, and they realized that whoever controls oil controls power. So they stopped looking west and turned east. The first American footprint in the Middle East was tiny. A single company from California that wanted to explore the deserts of Saudi Arabia for oil. A risky bet, because nobody knew for certain if there was anything underneath that sand. And the kingdom they were entering, it was deeply conservative, religiously strict, run by a royal family that did not exactly welcome Western outsiders, but in 1938, they struck oil on the eastern coast of Saudi Arabia, and everything changed. American oil executives, workers, entire families, they started arriving in Saudi Arabia, setting up small cities, little pockets of American life in the middle of the Arabian desert. Air conditioning, movie theaters, women driving cars, alcohol, all of which was, to put it very mildly, deeply unpopular among the local population. But the oil was flowing, and the Saudi royal family was getting very, very rich. So the relationship continued. And then the American government made its move. It approached the Saudi royals and said, "Why don't we set up a small military base here just to protect things? Protect you, protect us, protect the oil." The Saudis agreed with one condition: no American flag on Saudi soil, not a flagpole, not a flag, just a small plaque on the side of a building. That was the deal, and that was the beginning of the American military presence in the Middle East. And now, this partnership between America and Saudi Arabia was not happening in a vacuum. The rest of the Middle East was watching, and they were not happy. You have to understand the mood of the region at this time. These were newly independent nations, nations that had just freed themselves from European colonialism. The idea of another foreign power setting up bases, drilling their resources, deeply offended the sense of sovereignty many people in the region felt. But the oil money was too powerful, and the Americans were too determined. Then came the 1950s, and a new reason for American involvement: the Cold War. The Soviet Union was expanding its influence, offering an alternative model: communism, and it was approaching Middle Eastern nations with an open hand. The United States could not allow that, not in a region sitting on top of the world's most valuable energy resource. So America started playing a different game. Not just oil, but politics, covert operations, power. In Iran, there was a democratically elected leader, a man chosen by the Iranian people. But America feared he was drifting too close to the Soviet Union. So, together with the British, the CIA helped overthrow him and installed a dictator more aligned with Western interests. A dictator the Iranian people did not choose and would never forget. At the same time, the newly declared State of Israel was escalating tensions with its Arab neighbors. America chose to support Israel, funding it, arming it, standing behind it firmly. This created a massive backlash from the Arab oil-producing nations, who saw American support for Israel as a direct betrayal. Some of them used oil as a weapon. They cut off exports, created artificial shortages. Gas lines stretched across American cities. It was the world's first major oil crisis. But eventually, things stabilized. Deals were made. Tensions cooled on the surface. Underneath, the anger remained. Now, let us introduce a character who represents everything that was building up in this region. His name is Osama, and to understand him, you need to meet his father. Mohammed bin Laden was a construction man. Saudi Arabia, mid-20th century, he built things for the American oil operations: runways, infrastructure, facilities. His company grew enormous as the American presence expanded. He had 54 children by 22 wives. One of those children was named Osama. Osama bin Laden grew up watching all of this. The American presence in his country, the American bases on Saudi soil, the American support for Israel, American influence spreading across what he saw as holy Islamic lands, and he was angry. In the late 1970s, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, Osama saw his opportunity. He traveled to Afghanistan. He brought money from his family's construction wealth. He brought infrastructure experience. And he brought an uncompromising dedication to pushing foreign powers out of Muslim lands. He joined the Afghan resistance fighters, trained them, funded them, and fought alongside them for 10 brutal years. And here is the remarkable detail. The Americans were secretly supporting those same fighters. The enemy of their enemy was their friend. Weapons, money, intelligence. The United States pumped enormous resources into the Afghan resistance to bleed the Soviet Union. It worked. The Soviets eventually retreated, defeated, humiliated. Osama returned to Saudi Arabia a battle-hardened believer. He had beaten a superpower, and now he formed a group, Al-Qaeda. The mission? To protect Islam from foreign domination through violence, if necessary. Saudi Arabia was uncomfortable. They were getting rich from the American partnership. They told him to calm down. When he would not, they took away his passport. Then came the Gulf War. Iraq's Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990. The Saudi royals were terrified. If Saddam could take Kuwait, what would stop him marching into Saudi Arabia next? Osama actually offered to defend the kingdom with his fighters, the men who beat the Soviets. The Saudis rejected him. Instead, they called America. Dick Cheney arrived in Saudi Arabia with the full weight of the American military behind him. 37 nations joined the coalition. American bombers, American warships, American soldiers on Saudi soil. They pushed Saddam back in a matter of weeks. The Americans won. The Saudis were grateful. The bromance was restored. And then the American forces stayed. They set up permanent bases across Saudi Arabia. More presence than ever before. The guardians of the oil-rich kingdom for Osama bin Laden. This was the final betrayal. Not only had his own country rejected him, not only had they chosen America over him, but now the American military was permanently stationed on the most sacred land in Islam, the land of Mecca, the land of Medina. He left, and he began planning. The attacks that followed over the next decade were precise, coordinated, funded by construction wealth, executed with the discipline of someone who understood logistics. And by 2001, he was planning the attack that would change everything. Now, while all of this is unfolding around America and Saudi Arabia, the broader region is being shaped by another war that very few people talk about today. But that explains almost everything about the Middle East we see now. The Iran-Iraq War, 1979. Iran has just had its revolution. The American-backed Shah has been overthrown. A Shia religious government under Ayatollah Khomeini takes power. The new Iranian government begins broadcasting radio messages across the Arab world. Rise up. Overthrow your rulers. Join the revolution. Saddam Hussein of Iraq hears this and feels threatened. His country has a Shia majority that he suppresses. If the Iranian revolution inspires them to rise up, his power is finished. But he also sees an opportunity. Iran is weak. Its military is fractured. He has been wanting to reclaim territory along the border for years. This is the moment. In September of 1980, Saddam invades Iran. What follows is 8 years of one of the most destructive wars of the 20th century. Trench warfare, chemical weapons, human wave attacks, cities bombed, hundreds of thousands killed, possibly over 1 million total dead. And into this war, the entire world poured itself. Saudi Arabia and Kuwait funded Iraq. They feared Iranian revolution spreading to them. Israel secretly sold weapons to Iran. It preferred weak enemies fighting each other. The Soviet Union supplied Iraq with weapons. The United States gave Saddam intelligence, satellite imagery, technology, and crucially, diplomatic cover. Even when Saddam used chemical weapons against Kurdish civilians in northern Iraq, killing tens of thousands, the American government looked away. Documents later, declassified, confirmed this. They knew, and they said nothing. Think about what this means. America helped arm a man it knew was gassing his own people. The war ended in 1988 with a ceasefire. No borders changed. Over 1 million dead. Both nations devastated. But the real consequences were invisible at the time. Iran came out of the war deeply suspicious of the outside world. Its leaders concluded that no foreign power could ever be trusted, that the only path to survival was self-reliance, and eventually, nuclear deterrence. Saddam came out humiliated, broke, deeply in debt to Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, furious that he had fought what he saw as a war on behalf of the Arab world and received nothing in return. A few years later, he invaded Kuwait to take what he felt he was owed. And that brought America back. The Gulf War, the permanent bases, the presence that never ended. And then came September 11th, 2001. After the towers fell, the conversation in Washington was immediate. Not just about Afghanistan, not just about al-Qaeda, about Iraq. We now have access to documents from that period, classified memos, notes from meetings between the CIA and British intelligence, a document known as the Downing Street Memo. What these documents reveal is striking. Senior American officials were not simply reacting to a terrorist attack. They were looking for an excuse. They had already decided they wanted to remove Saddam Hussein. They needed a story to sell to the public, to Congress, to the world. The story they chose: weapons of mass destruction, and links between Saddam and al-Qaeda. There was almost no credible evidence for either. The CIA's own internal assessment said its conclusions about Iraqi weapons programs relied heavily on assumptions and judgment, rather than hard evidence. The al-Qaeda connection was based on one interrogation, one source, whose testimony their own analyst noted lacked specific details and was likely fabricated. But the story was told anyway, with absolute certainty, on television, in front of the United Nations, before Congress. Colin Powell, Secretary of State, one of the most respected figures in American life, sat before the UN Security Council with photographs and recordings, presenting it all as solid evidence. He later said he regretted it. Congress approved the war. The American public supported it by a narrow majority. And in March of 2003, the invasion began. The result: an estimated 500,000 Iraqi civilians dead, thousands of American and coalition soldiers dead, no weapons of mass destruction ever found, no nuclear program, no meaningful al-Qaeda connection. The country was dismantled, its army dissolved, its institutions destroyed. A power vacuum opened up, and into that vacuum came the next wave of violence. Now, while all of this is playing out between America and Iraq and Iran and Saudi Arabia, there is another people who have been caught in the middle of every single conflict in this region for decades. The Kurds, 30 to 40 million people spread across Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Syria, no country of their own, and used as a weapon by almost every power in the region. When the Ottoman Empire collapsed after the First World War, the European powers drew lines across Kurdistan. What could have been an independent Kurdish state was instead divided between 5 different countries, and every country that included a Kurdish population spent the next century suppressing them, banning their language, arresting their leaders, sometimes massacring them. In Iraq, Saddam used chemical weapons on Kurdish towns. The Halabja massacre, over 5,000 killed in a single attack, part of a broader campaign that killed tens of thousands more, a genocide, carried out with weapons technology partially provided by the United States. Every time a foreign power needed fighters, they turned to the Kurds. The Americans in the 90s called on them to rise up against Saddam. When they did, America did nothing to support them. Saddam crushed the uprising. In Syria after 2011, when ISIS was taking over massive territory, America again turned to the Kurds, trained them, armed them, used them to fight ISIS on the ground. When Turkey objected and demanded America abandon the Kurds, a phone call changed everything. American forces withdrew. Turkey invaded. Kurdish towns were bombed with American-made weapons. The pattern is always the same. Use the Kurds, then abandon them. And yet, they keep fighting because they have no choice. Now, let us bring this all the way forward to the present, because everything we have talked about, the American presence, the oil politics, the overthrown governments, the unfinished wars, the armed and then abandoned groups, all of it flows into the conflicts we see today. Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen. These are not random phenomena. They are the products of this system. Hamas grew out of Palestinian desperation after decades of occupation, a strategy of divide and rule in which right-wing Israeli governments deliberately kept Palestinian factions divided, preventing any unified movement toward a state, while continuing to build settlements that made a Palestinian state physically impossible. The October 7th attacks of 2023 did not come from nowhere. They came from a pressure cooker that had been sealed and heated for decades. Hezbollah in Lebanon grew out of the Israeli invasion of 1982. Iran provided funding and weapons. Hezbollah became a parallel government in southern Lebanon, a military force with over 100,000 missiles, a proxy in Iran's long-running war against Israeli and American influence. The Houthis in Yemen grew out of religious and political marginalization, were fueled by Saudi and American backing of corrupt governments, received weapons from Iran, and eventually evolved into a force capable of attacking cargo ships in the Red Sea, disrupting 25% of global container shipping and firing missiles at Israel. All of these groups, all of these conflicts, they connect. Saudi Arabia and Iran are the central fault line, two powers fighting a cold war across the entire region, funding different sides in Lebanon, in Syria, in Yemen, backing proxies, avoiding direct confrontation, but constantly feeding the fire. And somewhere in the middle of all this sits a tiny country called Djibouti, right at the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the Gate of Tears, a choke point that connects the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden, through which flows 30% of global container traffic. Most of the oil that powers Europe, the fiber optic cables that carry much of the world's internet. The United States has its only permanent military base in Africa here. France has been here since the 1800s. Japan has its only foreign military base here. and China built its first ever foreign military base right down the road from the Americans in 2017. Two superpowers, one tiny country, watching each other right at the throat of the global economy. And Saudi Arabia itself is now attempting something extraordinary. Knowing that oil will not power the world forever, knowing that peak oil demand is expected around 2030, the Saudi government is using its oil wealth to build a post-oil future. NEOM, a $1.5 trillion project in the northwestern desert, a futuristic city, industrial zones on the water, luxury islands, mountain ski resorts built with artificial snow, and the centerpiece, a linear city called The Line, 170 kilometers long, designed for 10 million people, powered entirely by renewable energy and artificial intelligence. Impossible? Maybe delusional? Possibly, but the scale of construction happening in that desert right now is real. Hundreds of thousands of trucks, moving mountains, carving lines. Because Saudi Arabia understands something very clearly. Oil made them powerful, but oil is ending. And if they do not reinvent themselves, they will be left behind. So, what should a thinking person understand from all of this? First, the Middle East is not defined by ancient hatreds. It is defined by modern decisions. Decisions made by foreign powers who drew borders without asking the people who lived there. Decisions made by governments who installed dictators for convenience and abandoned democracies for oil. Decisions made by military planners who funded armed groups and then were surprised when those groups turned against them. Second, oil is still at the center of almost everything. The American presence, the Saudi power, the global shipping lanes, the wars that have been fought and funded. Follow the oil and you will understand the logic of most decisions made in this region over the last century. Third, every short-term fix created a long-term problem. Supporting Saddam against Iran created a dictator who would later invade Kuwait and destabilize the region for decades. Arming Afghan rebels to fight the Soviets created the conditions for al-Qaeda. Overthrowing the Iranian government in the 1950s created the revolutionary government of 1979. Suppressing the Kurds created insurgencies that lasted generations. Fourth, the people who live in the region, the Yemenis, the Kurds, the Palestinians, the Lebanese, the Iraqis, have almost never been the primary consideration of the powers making decisions about their lives. They have been resources, proxies, obstacles, occasionally allies, rarely the point. And fifth, the system is still running. The fault lines are still active. The proxy wars are still being funded. The choke points are still contested. The oil money is still flowing. For now, the Middle East is not a mystery. It is a system. Complex. Yes, but logical. Once you understand the incentives, the decisions make sense. Once you understand the history, the present becomes readable. That is the business of understanding power. And with that, the Blackbook closes. Subscribe, and we will open the next page soon.